Today we're going to continue talking about the topics in this chapter 21, and we're going to move from the discussion of the skeletal system to talking about the muscular system. And there's a picture at the beginning of this portion of the textbook, and I've just actually taken a picture of it, and we'll come back to it in just a second. This is just a copy of what's in your textbook, so I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I want to preface this, the reason I brought this up right away is to show you that these labels, you'll notice that there aren't many muscles actually labeled in these pictures. And that's because you cannot go into all the details in a Biology 1 course about the muscular system. And so what your textbook has done, and I actually think they've done a pretty good job, the publishers have done a pretty good job with this, they've taken most of the major muscle groups and just organized them together to talk, so we can talk about the muscle types and the broader groups of muscles that are in your body. And again, I hope this piques the interest of some of you, and that you'll have a desire at some point to take an anatomy and physiology class where you can learn about this in much more detail. But the reason we talk about the skeletal system and the muscular system basically together is because the support and movement of the body it's required in the way that God made us, that they work together. You cannot have structure and function of the skeletal system without talking about the muscular system, because without the muscles, your skeleton cannot move. So it's a good combination to discuss one right after the other. So when you look at your textbook in this image, I'm going to point out some things to you, and these are the muscles and the muscle groups that you should be familiar with. We're not going to dive deep into anything else that's not listed here. So there are going to be some that you're familiar with. You've heard the term bicep, and most of you have probably heard the term tricep. And most of you have heard the term quad or quadricep, and you probably heard the term hamstring. So those are four pretty big muscle groups that you're already familiar with. So that's kind of the types of muscles that we're going to review / talk about in this chapter. As far as what you normally think of as muscles, let's put away the exterior part of our body where we see the muscles at work. We actually see them. So let's talk about a few that that you may and may not be familiar with. And we'll start over here. So you got to read some relay runners. They're handing off the baton. And this gentleman right here is reaching back with his arms as he's running, and he's on this arm. You can see he's grabbing the baton right there. Okay, so with his arm extended back, you have a very good image of this muscle set right here. You have probably heard of these as triceps, but that's not the full name of the muscle. It's the triceps brachii. That's how you pronounce that. It has a partner on the front of the arm. So the tricep brachii is on the back. The biceps brachii are on the front. Okay, so your biceps are actually biceps brachii. Your triceps are actually triceps brachii. Your shoulder muscle right here on the top of your shoulder, that's your deltoid. All right. And then at your chest level, you've heard people refer to your pecs. Well, that's what they're talking about. And it's really the pectoralis major is what people are referring to when they use the slang pecs. So the pectoralis major is up here at top, but then you also have the pectoralis minor, which is this slimmer muscle, more narrow muscle just below the pectoralis major. And you've all heard reference to your abs. Well, these are your abdominals right here, and it's called the real name for your abs as a group. Now you have different sets of abdominal muscles, but as a group, you have your rectus abdominis. We're not going to go into the different groupings of those, of your ab muscles, all right? So just know that as a group, it's your rectus abdominis. But on the side here, You have another set of core muscles, and those are your obliques. So you have your side obliques, and then you have your front. The six-pack mentality, the six-pack idea is from your rectus abdominis muscles. And then you have the side abs there called the obliques. Now, if you come down on the lower portion of our body, these muscles, this group right here, it kind of looks like they're in, well, they're surrounded by this bracket here. These are your adductor groups, your adductor group of muscles. Now, those are for pulling and moving your legs on the interior towards your body. Okay, and you can squeeze things into your body with your legs. All right, the calf muscle actually is not, this one's a weird one. Like, why do we call it a calf muscle? Well, it's really the gastrocnemius. Okay, and then just below it, this little guy right here is the soleus. All right, and that takes care of the person, the relay runner who's receiving the baton. All right, the one that's handing off, you can see in his neck right here, the sternocleidomastoid. Right there, that's a mouthful. And then along your back, you have your traps or your trapezius, right here. Your hamstrings, so the larger group in the back of the leg. And then, of course, you have your quads, which is the quadriceps femoris group. Now, notice it's the quads, which you're familiar with, so that's going to be easy for you to remember, quadriceps. But then the femoris is because it's at the femur, where, remember, the bone is the femur in the upper leg, so it's the quadriceps femoris group. Now, let's talk about that idea of major and minor and why some muscle groups have that major. Not all of them, but some have the major and some have the minor. Well, the major, it should make sense to you. Those are the larger muscles in that group, whereas the minor are the smaller muscles. And then, if you ever see the term maximus, that's the largest muscle in that given region. Now, your book does not label these backside muscles here, but I am sure you have heard of the gluteus maximus. Okay, your backside actually has quite a large muscle set in your bottom area. All right, now let's talk about shapes. Why are some called deltoids, trapezoids, obliques? Well, it has to do with their shape. So when you see the term deltoid, like right here on top of your shoulder, well, that's a triangular shaped muscle. That's why it's called a deltoid versus a trapezius, which actually looks like a trapezoid. Think of those of you in geometry, you can appreciate that. But this right here, if you were to look at it kind of straight on, head on, looking down, it would look like a trapezoid. And then your obliques, right here along the side, those are the fibers that are arranged obliquely, which means in a slanted direction. So here's that idea too, like the adductor group that I mentioned, that allows you to pull into the thigh, draws into the thigh. So sometimes if you've ever been to a gym, I don't know how many of you are familiar with gyms, but they'll actually have these machines where you can sit and you can arrange the machine to where your legs are positioned on the outside of these cushion areas that are connected to the weights in the back. And if you squeeze your legs together, you're using your adductor muscles. But you can also use the machine. Sometimes it's a separate machine, or sometimes you just reverse the direction, reverse the pads, and you put them on you put those pads on the outsides of your legs and you push out with your legs. And those, so you have the adductor group. If you were pushing out, it would be the abductor group. And then sometimes that idea of the brachii, the biceps brachii, well, bi means two, ceps means head. So what's the origin? Now, it's not your literal head, it's the top of the arm, okay? But biceps brachii, bi, two, ceps, head, okay? So top of the arm. Now, sometimes, and a lot of this deals with who's naming what at what point in time, and also just a convenience factor. The person who's the groups of people who are working on naming these are doing it based on either Latin terms and what those mean, or sometimes it's just locations. So if certain things in your body already have a location, or a name, then they name the muscle groups based on where they're located. And that's what this means here, the sternocleidomastoid. Well, the reason it's called that is because it starts at the sternum and the clavicle. So you get the sternocleid and then the insertion at the mastoid process, all right, which is right here at your mouth. So that's just, that name strictly comes from where it's located on your body and other things that were already named. So that's how some of those names, different origins and names of those muscle groups come about. Okay. These are the only muscles you need to be familiar with. We're not going to go into all the different types within these groups. Okay. All right. So when we think about the structure of the muscular system, the bone begins, or the muscles begin where they attach to the bone. That's the origin. And then we talked about the insertion point, which is the place on the movable bone where the muscle attaches. So you got the stationary bone where the muscle attaches, that's the origin. The insertion is where on the movable bone where the muscle attaches. And then we just went through that naming process. They're named in a bunch of different ways, and there's really no rhyme or reason for that group of names. Honestly, it can depend on who just discovered it and how they wanted to name it. Now, there are different types of muscles that we need to discuss. Sometimes muscles aren't visible. As far as like you know, if someone's lifting weights, you see some certain muscles working harder. But that's not always the case, because our body has a lot of interior muscles that we would never see. All right, so the muscles that we just talked about on the exterior of our body, those are the skeletal muscles. And these are referred to, or sometimes called, striated muscles. And what that means is you have this tissue here, but then you have these lines that go through it. Those are the striations, and so it can be called striated muscle. But this is a microscopic image of what skeletal muscle looks like, and that is voluntary muscle. These are the muscles that are attached to your skeleton, and these are considered voluntary, meaning you have conscious thought about moving those muscles and moving that part of your skeleton with those muscles. So anytime you walk, you talk, you lift weights, you lift a book, you decide to take a run outside, you walk the dog, all the motions that are involved in that on the exterior anyway, are done by skeletal muscle. It's voluntary movement. You actually have to tell your brain to take a step. You actually have to tell your brain to pick up a pencil and use it. So your body is voluntarily doing that. Smooth muscle looks like this. Okay, this is your involuntary muscle group, meaning you do not give conscious thought to making these muscles work. You do not tell your intestines to move food through your body. You do not tell your bladder to expand to hold more urine and then to contract when you go to the bathroom. You just do it. You do not tell your stomach muscles to expand and contract and help process the food that you're eating. You don't have to think about any of that. Those are involuntary muscles, and this is what they look like under a microscope. Then you have your cardiac muscle, which in theory too is also involuntary. You're not telling your heart to beat, but that muscle looks a little different because it has to work a whole lot harder. So it actually has kind of a combination look of the striated or the voluntary and the smooth. Okay. So I don't think I mentioned this, but the voluntary muscles have smooth muscle tissue versus skeletal muscle tissue, and then you have the cardiac muscle, which is almost like a combination of the two. Now let's take a look at your skeletal muscle and how this works. All right, so you have to have, if you are going to move your skeleton, your muscles have to be attached to your skeleton to allow that movement to occur. So let's talk about some body parts. Now again, I just lifted this from your book. It's at the bottom of page 442 in your textbook. I literally just took a picture and uploaded it. So there it is at the bottom of page 442, along with similar pictures of the microscopic images of the types of muscles. All right. So tendons. All right, here are the tendons. Now look where this is the bone. You have a tendon, and then you have the muscle. So the tendons are the extension of the bone, basically, or the connective tissue that surrounds, that comes from the muscle to the bone. So that's going to connect your skeleton, whatever part of the skeleton this is attached to, the tendon does the connecting to the muscle. Skeleton, tendon, muscle. And then you have fascicles. So look at number 2 right here. These things here are called the fascicles. And they multiple fascicles work together to form, this is just like the cutout here, the muscle. So each one of these fascicles is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue, and it contains, depending on the type of muscle and how active it is and what its needs are to help you do what you need to do, it contains either up from 10 to up to 100 muscle cells. All right. Then you have these muscle fiber cells right here, which come, so you have tendon, muscle, fascicles, muscle fibers. So these little guys have lots of nuclei and a lot of mitochondria. Now think about that. Why would that be useful? What do your muscle cells need a lot of? What do mitochondria do? Hopefully you remember the mitochondria are your energy producers. So it should make sense to you that your muscle cells need, some of your muscle cells anyway, need a lot of energy makers, ATP. And then you have these myofibrils, these little guys down here at the end. These are little thread-like structures, and they are composed of 2 protein structures. They have a thick filament made of myosin and thin filaments made of actin. So those are important. We're going to talk about those in a sec. So these myofibrils have myosin, thicker filaments, actin, thinner filaments. And these guys overlap one another and give you that striated view of your muscular tissue. Now remember, this was the striated view right here. So it's because of the myosin and the actin overlapping in certain patterns that give you the striation. All right, so let's talk about that myosin and actin. This is what allows these 2 guys interacting, those filaments interacting with one another, are what allow muscle contractions to occur. And I'm going to come back. So let me show you. In your book, you have this drawing. That is also in your textbook. Again, I've just taken a picture of it and put it in the PowerPoint presentation. This is on page 423. And then we'll talk about, so you see here, these myosin filaments and these actin filaments are labeled. The myosin filaments are right here. The actin filaments are these blue lines here. So you got the actin filaments in the blue and the myosin filaments in the red. Okay. So let's go back real quick. So these actin filaments, remember, we're going to go back and look at that image, but those are those thin blue lines. They're connected at one end by what's called a Z-disc. But the actin filaments alternate with the myosin filaments, and so they overlap. And I know I've kind of repeated myself with that. Sorry. But a few other things to point out in this diagram. So this Z-disc, so right here is where this, like the Z-disc kind of looks like a zigzag right here. That's the Z-disc. That forms the edges of this thing called the sarcomere. This structure is what lets your muscles contract, because this sarcomere contains the actin and myosin filaments that push together and overlap every time you do a muscle contraction. Okay. So the M disc, so you get the Z disc is where it forms the edges of the sarcomere right here. Sarcomere is the contraction unit that has the myosin and actin filaments overlapping one another. Then you can see here the M disc, now right here through the middle. That's where those, see the red lines, the myosin, that is where those myosin and the sarcomere are connected at their midpoints. Okay, I know that's a lot. Go back and replay my voice talking about this if it's helpful. This is it's the same picture as in your textbook, but if you need to look in your textbook while I'm going over this, the textbook picture might be a little better close up and a little clearer if you want to get a better look at that. So just to review, the Z-disc forms the edges. The sarcomere is actually what causes or allows your muscles to contract, because that has the overlapping, and that sarcomere has lots of overlapping actin and myosin that work together as they overlap for your muscle to contract. All right, I am going to pause the video here. You'll have a few questions to answer, and then we will wrap this up tomorrow.